I am part of the working group, the patient research partner working group that I will introduce a little bit later. The objectives of this webinar are explained in a minute, and this is an overview of the content of the items that we will discuss in the coming hour. A little bit of history, explaining what a core outcome set is, telling about the OMERACT filter and specifically also the new filter that has been agreed in 2014. A few words about why patients are important in developing core outcome sets, and then finally say a few words about the role and experiences of patient research partners in OMERACT, working groups, and in the meetings. And I hope that at the end we will have time for some question and answers, and maybe a little bit of discussion. So this first webinar, it's the first of a series that we will have in the coming half year, will provide a general introduction into the goals and methodology of OMERACT. We will introduce why core outcome sets are important and also highlight why patients are important when we are developing them. We will learn you more about the role and experience of patient research partners in OMERACT. And some of you know about OMERACT, so please feel free to add if you think that would be helpful for the others. And then this webinar is also meant as a very first get to know the three key components of the original OMERACT filter, which are called truth, discrimination, and feasibility. And then finally, we will say a few words about what validity means and in what perspective this is important for patients. I think it's also important to highlight that attending these webinars does not automatically imply that people will be attending the OMERACT meetings. Okay, just introducing the people in the patient leadership team. There are currently 3 patients, and all RA patients, I must say. Pam Richards from the UK, Marieke Voshaar of the Netherlands, and Amy Leong from the United States. Then there are 2 members, 1 patient, which I am, and Laura Cossack, who is a professor of rheumatology in Paris. And we both are also the connection to the executive committee and member of that committee. And then finally, since this year, we have a small budget that is spent for some secretariat and logistical support, which is provided by Shauna Grosclack from Canada. She is based with Peter Tugwell in Ottawa, and she helps us with building the website, organizing the webinars, and all kinds of other activities that are necessary for a good functioning of the network. So let's start with a little bit of history of OMERACT. OMERACT stands nowadays for Outcome Measures in Rheumatology, but when it started actually as a standalone meeting, which was then called Outcome Measures in Rheumatoid Arthritis Clinical Trials. And the objective of this very first meeting that took place in Maastricht was to achieve consensus about the endpoints for clinical trials in rheumatology, but specifically for rheumatoid arthritis. So that was the only objective, to overcome the oceanic divide between Europe and the States, the United States, where they were measuring new interventions using different instruments and looking at different domains. And the problem with that was that the trial results were completely incomparable. And they with the help of also the FDA, started this meeting with the objective: can we achieve consensus on a minimum list of outcomes that every clinical trial should measure, and preferably in the same way using the same instruments? And after 2 days of very hard working, they achieved consensus on a set of 7, some say 8 domains, and that was perceived as a big success. And it afterwards also showed that it made really a difference in the value of doing clinical trials. So they started to continue doing this also for other rheumatic diseases, and they developed this kind of meetings and approach of consensus building. And you can see in the right column the places where they organized since 1992, every 2 years, this meeting, and going around over 3 continents, the North American continent, Australia, or Asia, and Europe. Characteristics of these meetings are that it is data-driven in contrast to opinion-based. It's an iterative consensus process, meaning that the consensus is built along the way, following the data, and with involvement on the third bullet point with all relevant stakeholders. It's very inclusive. Everybody is welcome who can add knowledge or experiences that matter to the meeting. The meetings are not educational, but very interactive, and the entire research activities are non-commercial, which also means that we are not discussing pharmaceutical products. So just an example of the very first rheumatoid arthritis core set. And you see here the domains. At that time, it was a mixture of domains and instruments. So you can see it's pain. It is something patient global assessment, physical disability, swollen joint count, tender joint count, one serum level, which is called acute phase reactants, and then something which is called physician global assessment. And this last item you will see less and less in the newer core outcome sets, because people tend to say what really matters are the objective measures, objective outcomes, and what the patient think, and not what the physician thinks. And then there was this 8th domain, which is called radiographs of joints, which is actually an instrument, while the domain that is measured would be something like damage or erosions. And this is the publication that came out of this. If anybody has a question, please feel free to use or the chat box or just raise it in the meeting. Are there any questions so far?
Not from me.
Okay.
I'm fine.
So let's go to why involving patients in outcome research. It was only after 5 meetings in 2000 that some of the medical doctors discussed the definition of something like what actually constitutes a clinically important change in response of a treatment. And then in the final session, participants, and specifically because some said, that is a question that we cannot answer. That is a question that actually can only be answered by patients. We can think an improvement from 5 to 3 is important, but we are not sure whether that's the same for patients. So why are we not involving patients in the meeting? And that is actually what happens. They prepared and they invited 11 patients to come to the next OMERACT meeting in 2002. And I know that Gert Jenny from Oslo is on the line, and she was one of the delegates that attended this meeting. And here you see a photo, a very relaxed photo where the patients and the physicians were working outside. This was also Australia, on evaluating the RA core set. It was a very relaxing meeting in the way that our only task was a kind of focus group and trying to develop this, to review this core set. And it was a very productive meeting because what was concluded was that there are some very relevant patient outcomes that were not part of the RA core set. And think about fatigue, general well-being, sleep disturbances, but also food problems, and for instance, social participation in daily life. And afterwards, these are all items that have been taken home by the researchers to start gathering data on these. And I think this first meeting really set the theme for all the future developments. So now let's have a look at the OMERACT objectives. The OMERACT objective is really to develop core outcome sets. And as a difference to the core set that I just showed you, since 2014, we distinguish two different types of outcome sets. The first is a core domain set, and the second one is a core instrument set. And later on I will explain the difference between these two. So the first objective is to develop these types of core outcome sets for all rheumatic diseases, but it also wants to develop the methodology, and OMERACT is still leading the way in how core outcome sets should be developed. And one part of this is also mentioned under 3, that you develop a kind of research agenda where you define what the most important and urgent items are that needs to be addressed. So what is a core outcome set? There is after OMERACT, a couple of years ago, I think around 6 or 7 years ago, a group in the UK that started to look at the OMERACT way of developing core sets and said, actually, this is also what we should do for other diseases. And they established this organization called COMET, which is the Core Outcome Measures in Effectiveness Trials initiative. And they defined a core set as an agreed standardized set of outcomes representing, let's have a look, the minimum that should be measured and reported in all clinical trials of a specific condition and are also suitable for use in clinical audit or research other than randomized trials. And this comes also close to what OMERACT is doing. And you should see that it is only meant to be used in clinical research. And OMERACT actually only says it's for clinical trials and longitudinal observational studies. And it's also important, and that's why outcome sets are important, that the outcome set needs to be measured but also reported. So you are obliged to report on all the core outcome sets. And actually, why are we doing this? Well, first of all, because the results of clinical trials are it's an important source for generating clinical evidence for treatments. We know by doing this which treatments are better than others. And the use of standardized outcomes across trials, which investigate similar interventions for similar patient groups, promotes better interpretation, comparability, and clinical applications of trial results. And this is what I also mentioned in the beginning. By reporting it, you prevent researchers for selective reporting. And of course, the OMERACT way of developing has become a very clear guidance for all trialists across the world. And this facilitates interpretation and better comparison of trial outcomes. And finally, I think also FDA in the United States and the EMA in Europe has learned a lot of the OMERACT way of developing consensus on outcomes and highly recommend other researchers to follow the same way. So what is the same way? As said, since 2014, OMERACT distinguishes two types of core sets, and they are sequential, which means that first of all, you have to develop a core domain set. And a core domain set is actually a set of domains that give you an idea what you have to measure. And this reflects what the participants and absolutely also the patients find important to measure. And only if you have finalized your core domain set, you start thinking about a core instrument set or a core outcome measurement set. And that set provides the instruments and show you the way how you can measure the domains that are collected in the core domain set. And this is something that COMET and the definition of COMET does not do. So they don't distinguish between domains and instruments. While OMERACT says this is very important, it doesn't make sense to discuss instruments if you don't know first what is important and what you have to measure. The current format of a core set is this image that's shown here. So there are actually 3 circles, and it's only the inner circle that reflects the core domain set. So that's the agreement of a set of around 5 to 8 domains that are important and should be measured in every clinical trial and longitudinal observational study. And of course, there are always domains that we find are important but they are not critical for measuring the effectiveness of a trial. So they are put in the middle circle. Sometimes these are also domains that are important, but we don't have validated instruments for them. So then they can be put in the middle circle, or they can even be put in the outer circle, where all items and questions are collected that together forms the research agenda. Are there any questions so far?
No, thank you.
Okay.
Fine.
Yeah, it's very clear. Okay, so then this is an overview. It looks quite complex of all the domains and the way that OMERACT structures the discussions around a domain selection. But what you can see here is actually that every core set should at least comprise one domain from these core areas of health. The first, and that sounds maybe a little bit strange, but the first is death. They say death, or in other words, survival. It could be the effect of, well, the people that are dying, you always have to register and measure in every clinical trial. And actually that's also what the FDA and the EMA requires you to do. So this is relevant for every disease and an important outcome. But then there is this category that we call life impact. These are mostly the domains that are relevant from the perspective of patients. They are subjective. They are in most cases measured by using PROs, patient-reported outcomes. And here you can see a number of examples. Quality of life is a very important one. Activity and participation, social participation, workplace participation, that are the newer domains. Psychosocial support, but also items like fatigue belongs to this category. Then there is a third category that we use called resource use, and it refers to economical impact. So there are overall societal consequences of new interventions. They have impact on the individual income, on the healthcare system. You can think about direct and indirect costs, and also loss of productivity. And the color of the resource use is a little bit lighter than the other three, which means that this is one that is optional but not mandatory to put into a core set. So the recommendation is that you add one item, one domain in this category of resource use, but it's not obligatory. And then finally, there is the fourth category that is called the pathophysiological manifestations. And this refers to the ICF system, and it refers to body function and structure. These are all the physical signs and symptoms of the disease that medical doctors, researchers are most knowledgeable about, and that they traditionally put in the core set. So this is the global approach of a core domain set. At least one from these four areas of health. And then there are two other categories. One is adverse events, which is also mandatory from the perspective of the FDA and EMA. And then something that we call contextual factors. And this is something OMERACT is now exploring. So just to give you one example, what is the effect of people who are well able to self-manage compared to people who are not able to self-manage or cope with their disease? Does that give a different impact? And does it influence the outcome if someone participates in a clinical trial? So it doesn't directly influence the effectiveness of a trial, but it is an indirect factor that sometimes can play an important role. And this is something we are now currently exploring. So, in a summary, requirements for a core domain set: it's death, at least one life impact domain, at least one pathophysiological manifestation, optional one domain reflecting resource use, and then adverse events, always, because that's mandatory. Now we go to the OMERACT filter, which is this mythical term that's already out there since the beginning. And it has made actually quite a big impact in research. It's the OMERACT approach of consensus building in outcome set development. And here you see a flow chart of how this works. So every new working group that looks at the development of a new core outcome set starts with step 1, identifying domains. Then you have to prioritize them. And if you have done that, you bring it to an OMERACT meeting for decision making. And these 3 steps are described in the boxes in the middle. You have to do a systematic literature review. You may add this by doing qualitative research, having interviews, focus group meetings, and then you do something that is called data mining, getting information from databases of patients in trials and studies. And this is something where also the pharmaceutical company comes in. They are an active partner in the work that OMERACT is doing. And to do the data mining, for instance, we rely on the collaboration with pharma companies that provide their data sets to researchers, for instance, to look at the outcomes on different domains and how specific instruments perform. If you have done that and you have a big overview of all the different domains, then you start prioritizing them. And the most preferred way in OMERACT is by doing a Delphi. And the Delphi exercise is a 2 or 3 round exercise where people from home prioritize a set of domains by asking them, what are the 10 most domains for you? And you continue asking that question till you have reduced your set of outcomes to something like between 5 or 8 or 9 domains. If you have that set of domains, you organize, you ask OMERACT to organize a workshop. And during that workshop, which is a 2.5-hour session, you introduce your data, you break out in different small group discussions, discuss the findings, and then at the end of the entire meeting, people come together and everybody votes whether they agree that the working group has done their homework, the data are convincing, and they agree on the domains or on the instruments that they should be part of the core set. And this is called the OMERACT Filter 2.0. So this is the new way agreed in 2014. Is it clear for all?
Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Okay. So just again, yeah, thanks. Again, the difference between these two, you have a core domain set that sets out what is important. You have the core instrument set that says how should you measure these domains. And then it's important to realize that the methodology of developing these two types of core domain sets are not completely the same. So they are a little bit different in the sense that the important role of the different stakeholders is not the same. The method for identifying the relevant items and how to collect additional data is different. And then finally, also the way that you develop consensus might not be the same. But this is something we are also now developing and exploring. And I will try to give you some examples why the two ways are not the same. So first, let's have a look at the first step, which is how we develop a core domain set. This is another, it looks like a complex figure, and that's also what it is. But you can see here are the four. You see my arrow?
Yes.
Okay. So these are the four live core areas of health, where one has to go into the core domain set. You have the adverse events and the contextual factors. Here, the work that you have been doing, literature review, additional qualitative research, and this is only for developing the core domain set. And then with sufficient stakeholder input, and specifically patients and their proxies, caregivers, they are very important because, as said, they are the ones that need to indicate which domains are important. So the role of patients, and that's my opinion also, in developing a core domain set is more important than in the selection of instruments. There we will
Martin?
see. Yes?
Can I ask you, what is proxies?
Yeah.
Patients and their proxies?
Yeah. As far as I know the English language, I think it is family members. But maybe I can ask Ben, you are native English speaking? Well, Australian?
Yeah, so a proxy is somebody, it doesn't have to be a family member, but it's somebody that stands in for you to give an opinion or a point of view when you are unavailable. So it's just somebody who you trust to be able to give a point of view when you aren't there to do it.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. So, and then in the consensus phase, it is also important that actually patients should have 50% of the votes apart from the other stakeholders. This is something that OMERACT is struggling with because in the Delphi method, so when we are prioritizing and selecting the domains, it is feasible to get a balanced representation of the different stakeholders. But when we go to the meeting, the final meeting where the voting takes place, the patients only make up 10% of the delegates. So there it is really a challenge to get equal representation of patients in the final consensus building. And this will also be one of the main topics and challenges for discussions in OMERACT in 2018. So let's have a look at the procedure in the second step when we are going to look at instruments. There we do a little bit different. As you can see here, the core domain set is the starting point. We have this set of 7 or 8 domains. We do a literature review looking at what are the instruments most used, and if you have that list, for each instrument you look, do we have an instrument? And if it's there, you start evaluating them by looking at a series of criteria that we called the old OMERACT filter. And these are the 3 criteria of truthful, discriminative, and feasible. And we come back to that in a minute. And if an instrument fulfills the OMERACT filter, then and that is the case for every domain in a core set, you have a draft core outcome set that you can send to the OMERACT meeting for final voting. Of course, if there is for one domain not a validated instrument, so an instrument that has proven to be a good quality instrument to measure that domain, you might want to develop a new domain yourself. You have to do validation studies, or you have to look for them in the literature, and otherwise do this research yourself before coming back to OMERACT. The assessment of instruments is quite tough. So that's not an easy procedure. And in one of the next slides, I will show you the difficulties in doing that. That also shows a little bit that the role of patients is more limited there than in defining a core domain set. So this is what you do when you are looking from the old OMERACT filter to an instrument. You have to look at something like what we call the psychometric properties of an instrument. And truth means here, does the instrument measure what it is supposed to measure? In other words, are all items relevant? And are all essential aspects covered and all response options appropriate? So do the answers in a questionnaire make sense? This is something that patients can do, and where it's important that patients say. So we have been some of us have been closely involved in the development of an instrument for the domain of fatigue. And there were a couple of instruments, and when patients looked at the different ones, it became very clear that some instruments, they said, this is really not what we mean by fatigue. If we say fatigue is an important impact of our disease. So there was not a good match between the instrument and the items, the questions that were asked, with the domain. And this is something that actually also, again, only the patients can do best. They can check whether an instrument and the items are really relevant and reflecting what is meant with the domain of interest. And this is something what is also called face validity. Then there are two other items in the OMERACT filter. One is discrimination, and there you look at reliability, and part of that is the instrument stable if the disease is stable. So if I fill a questionnaire in now and my situation is not changing, it should measure exactly the same next week. It should also be sensitive to change, which actually means that if there is a change, the instrument should capture that change. Well, for all these types of psychometric properties, the epidemiologists and statisticians have developed a very rigid system of assessment, which for lay people like us is very difficult to follow. And that is something that I think physicians and epidemiologists, they should do the testing and the assessments of these types of psychometric properties. And that is not where the importance of patient involvement lays. That changed a little bit if we go to the third one, the last point, of course, the feasibility of an instrument. There you look whether an instrument is feasible, and then there you not only look at what is the impact for the physician or for the researcher, what are the costs of the instruments, are they, how do you call that, licensed? Do you have to pay for the use, which does not make it more accessible? But of course also, what's the burden for patients? Is it easy to fill in, or is the instrument or method easy to undergo? That is something, of course, that patients can again be very much involved in assessing that. So from my perspective, patients should actually be involved when it comes to truth, the face validity of an instrument, and the feasibility, and much less in looking at the psychometric properties of discrimination. This is the new scheme that comes with this new domain. So actually 4 questions. OMERACT says you don't have to look at the discrimination part if the instrument doesn't have face validity. So if you already said it's not a good match with the domain and you give the instrument a red as a result, you can immediately stop looking at that instrument further. You can also look at the feasibility. If you conclude and you have consensus that it is not feasible, it doesn't make sense also to continue. Thus also then you immediately stop studying the instrument and it will not be endorsed for inclusion in the core instrument set. But there are 2 other categories as shown on this slide, and that is amber. So continue with caution. So there has been some issues, but it's not critical. So it can still be a good instrument, and then you continue. And that's also when it's a green, you continue looking at that instrument and you go to the next criterion of the OMERACT filter. You look at the feasibility. Is it practical to use? If yes, and then you go to the technical assessment of, do the numeric scores make sense, which is also part of the truth, and can it discriminate between groups of interest? This is a complete science on its own, and Laura Kosek who is also on the executive and part of the leadership team, she has offered to do this, to set up a specific webinar on instrument assessment. So, and actually with this, I would like to end the introduction of the OMERACT filter and the OMERACT methodology. I've highlighted a little bit why patients are important and also specifically where their role should be. Of course, because they have the relevant disease. And OMERACT has really lead the way into active and equal involvement of patient research partners in the work that they are doing. So finally, I would like to go and say a little bit and discuss with you the role of patients also in course set development. It is important that course sets in the future, that the patient perspective is really included. It is becoming mandatory from the perspective of the authorities. Health authorities want patient involvement in all the work that OMERACT is doing, because they are also convinced that they are an important stakeholders, and we only want medications on the market that are supportive to the life of patients. And therefore researchers need patients, because only patients can assess, as said, the face validity of the instruments that they use, the course set that they develop, and the work that they are doing. And I think most of you are experienced patient research partners, so I think you are fully aware of that and also supportive to that. Patients help researchers to identify outcomes that really matters to them, and that can be preferably done in true partnership with all the team members. Participation, and certainly not in OMERACT, is not based on patient advocacy or promoting access to treatment. That has nothing to do with the work that OMERACT is doing, but it's really stepping with an open mind in conducting relevant and high quality research. And finally, providing patient input in the development and conduct of research activities. We don't do it only for our own disease, but actually for all the rheumatic diseases. And our experience is also that it is possible that we also contribute to the development of course sets in other disease areas than only our own diagnosis. Then a few words on OMERACT participation, participants and the conference. We will later on, I think in March, have a specific webinar on the implications if you're attending a conference. Again, the characteristic of the OMERACT meeting is it's not really an organization. It's a loose and independent worldwide organization. Actually, it's also a network of a great variety of professionals, rheumatologists, researchers, patients, representatives of the pharmaceutical companies, and the regulators. Everyone is welcome into one or more working groups, but the working groups do not get substantial financial support. I think all working groups that are coming to a meeting will receive only a small budget of 5,000 United States dollars, and most of it they spend it on getting one fellow and one patient to the meeting. They prepare their data that they are going to present at the meeting, and when they have finalized their work and they have asked for a workshop, then they will present their data and hopefully get the consensus that they are looking for. Are there any questions so far?
Not really.
No, not from me either.
Maybe Jenny has it, and Ben, you have been to one of the previous meetings. Has the methodology changed as far as you can see?
I think that we were talking about it in my last meeting. We were talking about changing the OMERACT filter, but so it is a little bit new to me. But it all makes sense from what you're saying. The difference between now and then.
Yeah.
It only feels like it's more organized and that they have a better structure. I mean, we were working a lot about the core set, the truth and feasibility when I was last participating, but so it's sort of getting more organized in a more easier way to understand, maybe, or easier to follow.
Yeah. Well, I think that's correct. And that's where I started. I think at the first meeting, the patient group was really a focus group with a lot of spare time. I think the people who are now attending a meeting have a full day, a packed program of small and larger meetings, workshop, breakouts, update sessions, preparation sessions, and that really is different from the first time when nobody had any experience in supporting patients to attend a meeting like this. And I think OMERACT over the past 15 years have developed quite some structures for support. That's true, yeah. And one of the things is also which is different, which is only true since 2014, that also one of the patient delegates, in the person of me currently, are member of the executive committee. But they are now even considering having a second person, patient, in the executive, which really shows the commitment of the organization to respect and capture the patient perspective as much as possible. And this is also that they are considering how can we increase the validity of the work that we are doing to create more opportunities for patients to contribute to the work. So contribute to the OMERACT work in working groups, but also with greater involvement in the voting and consensus building procedures. And this will be also a main part of the thinking and strategy of OMERACT in 2018. How can we guarantee that the voice of patients till the end of the process of final voting can be sustained? Because that's a little bit an issue that in the end the voice, there is a risk that you lose that voice just because of the small numbers. Okay. This is a little bit some additional information about the meeting, and this is the last slide. So it is every 2 years. It's a full 4 very full days of work. The meeting is organized on 3 different continents. There's always around 200 participants, and this will never become more because then it becomes undoable. There are several working groups, so they have really finalized their work and they want to get consensus. 20 patients are participating, and they just are full participants in the meetings, and all their expenses are covered. And the support, we have summarized a little bit of this here. There is a patient booklet with glossary. They will get a patient pack before the meeting, including lay summaries and biographies of all the patients that are attending. There are daily patient sessions where they discuss their experiences and look ahead to the next day, what will happen then and what's expected from us. We have developed a kind of buddy system where new ones and old ones are connected to support each other, and we also provide individualized programs where people should go to what type of sessions according to their interest also. So with having this, we are at the end of this webinar.